Welcome everyone to this virtual plenary session on FAIR4RS software. We have a shared notes document which Leila has just shared in the chat, but the URL for the document is also here, and for the collaborative notes and for these slides are on the screen, and we'll have links to we'll repeat this link on every other slide. So we'll start with a little icebreaker that is in the document. So I think at the top of the document there is an icebreaker with just a little question about how is the weather in the part where you're joining us from, and of course if you can also fill in your details on the document, that would be great. So a little bit of housekeeping notes. We are, of course, as I mentioned, we have the collaborative notes that are for everyone to share information, take notes, write down questions that we might have later on today, and the slides are also publicly available. And just as this is an RDA meeting, we are sticking to the RDA code of conduct. So just please keep that in mind. Welcome everyone. The goals of today's presentation is just to present some of the an update on the FAIR4 software principles, and basically we'll present the work from this working group, let you know what's the status and what are the next steps on this process of designing FAIR principles for software. And we'll of course use this session to enable community feedback on how to apply the FAIR principles for software, and we'll showcase some of the examples of early adopters that are already starting to adopt these FAIR principles for software. So this is the agenda for today. We'll do the introductions and icebreaker, which is this part of the session. Then we'll talk a little bit about the FAIR principles themselves. We'll have a small part of the session for questions about the how the principles have been designed and what they mean and what's the difference with the data principles, and basically for feedback from the community. And then we'll have the subgroup reports and the early adopter stories, and talk a little bit about the next stages. So the icebreaker, hope that you can see my screen, the shared document. So just having a quick look at what how the weather is in different parts of the world where people are joining us from. I'm joining from the Netherlands, from Utrecht, where it's been very gray and misty the whole day. It really starts to feel like autumn. Apparently in Illinois is sunny, and Uppsala is also gray and rainy, so not jealous of not being in Sweden. And Paris is sunny, that's good to hear. Strasbourg is also cloudy, so it looks like yeah, it looks like Chicago or Illinois are the places to be right now, because it's like where it's, or maybe Valence in France, it's also sunny. So it's nice to see that there's some sun in other parts as well. So I'm jealous of, in the best possible way, of people who have sunny weather at the moment. Nice, thank you for sharing that with us. So I'm gonna start a little bit proper with the session. So I'm going to start with telling you a little bit about the story from the FAIR4RS software principles, which many of you might already know this speech, but for those who are new to this work, The FAIR4RS software working group is started as a joint working group between RDA, Force 11, and Research Software Alliance. And basically, the work of this working group has focused on how are the FAIR software applicable to FAIR principles applicable to software as opposed to data. So basically, what's the motivation is that software is intrinsically different from data because of its executable nature. So software is not a special type of data, but it's a different thing. So it needs some FAIR principles that are different. And the original FAIR principles that were published in 2016 by Mark Wilkinson and company are intended to be applied to all the digital objects. But in practice, there needs to be some reinterpretation of some of the text of some of the principles to make it more applicable to software. This has been highlighted in several places. For example, the 6 recommendations for implementation of FAIR practice from the EOSC also recognizes that the guidelines need to be translated for other digital objects. And so there's been a growing interest on how exactly do FAIR principles are applicable to software, and this is what this working group is aiming for. So I'm going to give the word to Moran to tell us a little bit more about this.
Thank you, Carlos. So just before we're going to dive into those FAIR principles, I want to talk to you about the FAIR ecosystem. So software is in this ecosystem in many places. If you look at this diagram, you can find an icon for software, like a kind of a tag that shows us that software can be a digital object. It can be behind repositories, behind services, behind registries, and by itself as tools. So really, when we imagine scholarly ecosystem and we want this scholarly ecosystem to be fair, we see that software is everywhere, and we need to ask ourselves, where do we want to apply the FAIR principles for software? And since software has different tools, different roles, it can be a tool, it can be an outcome or a result, and it also can be a research object. Those different roles means that software is a complex object or concept, and we need to address this idea. And so next slide, please, Carlos. One of the questions is about services, because do we want to consider services also as software? But so yes, services are software. And this question was asked during the last plenary: should services be fair? And one of the answers to this question is this framework for assessing fair services, which introduces a new taxonomy about fair enablement, because services can enable fair, respect fair, or reduce fair. And when it enables fair, it can augment the fairness of the objects it holds, or it can just facilitate by actively helping to realize a particular fair principle. And yet, services and software are distinct things. A service is an instantiation of software which is dependent on the hosting platform of this service. So it is software, but it's a bit more complicated. And we need to keep this in mind even when writing and translating the FAIR principles to software, which you will be seeing in a moment, how as a working group we manage that services is still something separate that should be addressed separately. So check out this framework, and I'm going to give back the microphone to Carlos, which will be introducing you the FAIR principles now.
Okay, thanks, Moran. So yes, indeed, the FAIR principles for research software and how do they fit in this FAIR ecosystem. So we'll now go into a little bit of detail of these FAIR principles. I think it's important to notice that some of the this work was already it's already available, so that you can already cite these FAIR principles and you can find them as an output of the working group with this DOI. And I'll start with the principles in order of the acronym. So I think in terms of findability, what we concluded, I'm not going to go into the full text of each of the principles, because it's probably more useful to go into that in detail, to read it at home at your own pace. But I think some of the accompanying text of the FAIR principles is that for findability in particular, it's very similar to data, that the main aspect of findability is that metadata must be readable by humans and by machines, which is in a way similar to how it is to data. And this is essential for the discovery of software, and it should be in adherence to domain-specific standards. So I think in that way, it's very similar to the situation as it is for data. In terms of accessibility, so I think for accessibility, there was a little bit of discussion about what accessibility means for software, and we settled on the compromise that the accessibility is mainly we refer to the ability to retrieve the software, whether in binary form, executable form, or source code, from whichever platform it is stored, deposited, archived. So it means that software and its metadata must be retrievable via standard protocols. So this means that we should be able to access that binary or that source code. And I think one point that was important in terms of accessibility is that in software, in the software engineering world, there's a lot of discussions around accessibility as well, with a different meaning, meaning more of the allowing people to interact with the software regardless of disabilities. And I think this, although this is very important, it doesn't fall under the accessibility principles, but it's something that can fall more under the reusability part of the principles, or specifically on the usability part of the principles. In terms of interoperability, I think the definition of interoperability in the FAIR guiding principles overlaps quite a lot with the software, and mostly it focuses on how software exchange data with other pieces of software. So how two pieces of software can communicate via APIs or through standard interfaces. So how can data be exchanged between different pieces of software? So I think this is the main part of interoperability. Yeah, I think that was the main part that I wanted to highlight on interoperability. And reusability, I think here there was quite an important part, is that for reusability, we mean both, that software should be usable, meaning that it can be executed, and then it should be reusable. So it should be possible for the user to understand and modify and build upon the software and incorporate it into other software. So this really covers aspects of scientific reproducibility, running the same experiment again, but also of exploring software as a academic output, and as just reading the software and understanding what the software is doing and building new software on top of that. So importing it into as a library into another new piece of software. So I think that those were some of the considerations taken in reusability. And of course, there's more detail in the document itself, in the FAIR principles. Each of the principles has a little bit of the accompanying text that goes with the wording of each principle. Some of the considerations that came across during the discussion of the FAIR principles is that there has been, we've gone through several rounds of community feedback, and this is actually the fourth iteration of the principles, but we can consider this to be like the first stable version. So release 1.0, if we consider the other versions like beta versions of the software, of the FAIR software research software principles, sorry. And this is, okay, I think this is important to mention that it's the FAIR for research software principles. We don't see it as a final output or as a thing that is fixed, but we believe that they will continue to evolve and they will continue to develop in the future. So this is, of course, the first stable version that we're releasing into the public, but they can continue to evolve as the field of research software continues to evolve. So that's one thing to consider. Some of the changes that are in the in the software principles are mostly on the language, that they are aspirational, meaning that they talk about the software how we want it to be and how we want it to be in the future. So in that sense, they're aspirational, and they are not necessarily an indication of what software must already be in order to be considered fair. So it's a growth path, it's a trajectory. It's not a stick in the ground that says whether you're fair or you're not fair. And some of the challenges with the that we encountered is that the need for the community to have some guidance around these principles. So to some extent, what we've noticed from the community is that there's an desire to have some guidance, like a checklist that you can follow to see how you're how to improve your software to make it more fair. And this type of checklist is not the same that the principles. They go along the same lines, but they're not exactly the same. And these specific guidance is still something that can be developed depending on the needs of different communities. Another of the difficulties that we've encountered in the process is the difficulties of the jargon, that sometimes when we speak about metadata, audience that is not specialized in a particular field might get a little bit lost. So I think it's very important to communicate about the FAIR4 research software principles in a without trying to avoid as much as possible jargon, or always having some additional guidance on or additional clarification on what it's meant in these principles. many different forms of software, as Moran said, services, libraries, scripts, and these are different types of software. And to what extent they're all covered by the principles. It's as Moran mentioned, it's a tricky balance to achieve. So it's what's covered and what's not covered. It's very difficult to determine from the start. But the principles provide some guiding text along those lines. And how to best address the challenges of adapting these principles from data into software, where there have been already a large number of principles related to software engineering, which might be relevant and overlap. So meaning that there's already a lot of good practices for developing software outside of the research domain, or even in the research domain, that partly overlap, but partly are different from the FAIR4 software principles. And how to align with all of these existing guidance has also been one of the challenges, to figure out what are the differences, what is the added value of having these principles, why are they important in that sense. So I think these are some of the considerations that we've come across while developing the principles. Now, I think I'm probably going a little bit ahead of schedule, but I would like to change now for the key questions. So in our shared document, we have some questions. So we would like to now open the floor for questions that you, as potential adopters of these FAIR4 software principles, might have of what these principles mean in practice for you, or how can you adopt them, or any questions of how the process has developed, or what are the future steps. We would just like to have some feedbacks from the audience. So I don't know if there's any questions already that have been posted in the chat, or in the document. So feel free to
we don't have questions, not really questions, a couple of comments. One comment about services being far more than software, and another comment about the OGC Fair Climate Services Initiative. And the information shared is on the notes as well.
Do you want to comment on the services part, Moran?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Carlos. So I'm sorry, I've kind of hijacked this session to introduce the framework that we were working on FAIR. And there are some people in the FAIR4 software working group that think that services should be also considered as a software object on which we need to apply the FAIR principles. I am from the other school. I think that we shouldn't, and that's exactly like one of Tom's comment, that that services are more than software. No, I don't think it's more, it's just different and more complex. And I don't think that we need to consider them in the same space. So we do need to think of services as software, because behind the service there's a software, and this software, so the source code or the executable, should be preserved, and it would be good for it to be also fair. But the service is a thing that we are using somewhere that is hosted, and this is very complicated to keep it alive and to keep it fair. So to consider services, the framework that FAIR has produced is more adapted. And so that's why I'm commenting that now, and I'm sorry that I hijacked in the beginning of the session, and I'm kind of pushing the comments towards services. I think that in this space, we need to come back to software in the place plain sense of software, the thing like the kind of original object, I would prefer the source code, but some people kind of want to see also executables to be fair. But if you have any comment on that, you can open your camera, your microphone. Remember, we are recording, so you can answer me, say I'm totally wrong, or write it on the notes. You can also say that on the notes, even though I see I completely agree there on the notes directly. But yes. So this part of the session, we wanted to have key questions answered by you on the document. If you have other suggestions for other questions that you would like to see discussed during the session, it would be very nice of you to offer those to the session. And I think that, Carlos, what was the first question?
So actually, before jumping to questions, I see that there's a hand up. So, yeah.
Hi, my name is Emma. I know that my name on the screen is not the same. I have a question about the interoperability of software and how one achieves that, because I'm not a software engineer, but I can imagine that there are different types of softwares that do not communicate very easily between each other, and different types of softwares that countries of low income might not have access to either. So how do you make sure that a software is interoperable using an API if you don't know that the person using it actually has access to the tools in order to use it how they want to use it? I apologize for the vagueness of the question. It's more like, how do you ensure that every piece of software is completely interoperable and usable by everybody?
Can I answer that, Carlos, or do you want to answer that?
Go for it, and go. And if there's anything to add, I'll add.
Oh, okay, thanks. So you can't. Not all pieces of software can be interoperable with everything else on the planet because of many reasons. The first one, that some pieces of software can't just be reconstructed with other pieces of software. The idea here with interoperability, the idea for FAIR is that we are looking at increasingly fair. So we want to improve our pieces of software so it can be more fair than before and more interoperable than before. And if we look at the principles that are here, that it can exchange data and or metadata via an application programming interface that is described through standards. That doesn't mean that all software will be discussing with all other software. It just means that these protocols are documented and that they are open. Maybe, Carlos, you have something to add to that?
No, I think you've mentioned it very very clearly. I think it's mostly about having clarity that you should, if your tool produces a specific data format, that as much as possible, you should try to use data formats that are easy for other pieces of software to read, right? So I don't know, for giving a silly example, that you produce, that your tool produces the CSV files that are readable by other tools that read CSV files as much as possible. Of course, this is not, like Moran said, it's not possible for every piece of software to be interoperable with every other piece of software, because sometimes you will have specific data formats for I don't know, I don't know, for the genetic coding of some protein, that there's a specific data format that you will need for that, and then that won't be compatible with other pieces of software, but that as much as possible you use standard ways of exchanging information. I believe Leila might have something else to add. Do you see a hand?
So
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead, Leila.
Sorry, thank you. Emma, is not really an answer to your question, but more a comment. We know that we need to reach different regions, and we have been trying to do so because to start with, we cannot say that a software will be fair for everybody if not everybody understands what fair means. So we need to start with that. And we have been trying to reach audiences outside, let's say, the regular ones. The regular ones are usually Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US, and Europe. So we are doing an effort there. So people in different regions can also start applying these guidelines that we are working on. So they also understand what they can expect from others and what others are expecting from them in regards of FAIR.
Got it. So it's more, instead of a binary approach, it's more of a increasingly, let's try to get there, and probably there will be exceptions because it's not always possible. Okay, thank you.
No, thank you. It's a very good question. It's it's good to know that it's not always immediately clear how this interoperability works for every type of piece of software. So I think now we can maybe move to some of the questions for the community, for everybody in this session. So I guess the first one that we have in the document is what would you expect from this type of plenary session? What would be the expected outcome? Why are you here? What do you expect to get out of this session, I guess? And we've made some space in the document, so if you want to write your name and your answer, and if you can tell us, is there anything in particular that you would like to get out of this session? And we hope that we'll be able to answer your questions and maybe adjust the session a little bit if there's anything in particular you would like to get out of this session. Moran says, if you don't want to give your name, you can do this anonymously as well. That's perfectly fine. I'll just give people a few minutes to start typing in the document. Yeah, and there's a comment also on the chat about interoperability, that interoperability for the sake of interoperability doesn't make much sense, and it needs to be specific to the use case. So yeah, I think this is exactly right, and probably you don't want to be interoperating apples with pears. You don't want to be necessarily combining every possible sort of data, but it needs to make sense in the context that you're using it. Yeah. At the same time, as if you're exchanging or interoperating apples with apples, you want to make sure that you use the correct Apple interoperability open standard as much as possible. Yeah. Thanks for the comment. Okay, and I see that there's some opinions already appearing in the document of what would you expect from this type of session. Some people would just get an update on the work of the working group. Okay, I think that's something that we can, I hope you can get out. I'm just interested in the activities of the group in general, so first contact to grasp some ideas, that's perfectly fine. So in that sense, if there's anything that you would like further us to go into more detail, feel free to ask or just yeah. Yeah. Okay, so somebody asks, where does the 4 recommendations of open source software belong in this working group? Leila, I'm not sure if that's something that you might want to, because yeah.
The 4 recommendations for open source software discuss a little bit the recommendations, those 4 recommendations in the context of FAIR and how it is aligned to it. So it is one of the words that we took into account when we, oh my goodness, maybe I have to give a little bit more of history. Before we start this working group in the Research Data Alliance, there was a paper towards FAIR principles for research software. And the people working in that paper, some of them, well, some of us, I should say, had worked on the 4OSS paper as well. So we took into consideration what we had already worked on the 4OSS paper when we were thinking about the FAIR principles for software. Daniel, Dan, you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say that we're talking about FAIR principles, right? Findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Right? We're not talking about open necessarily. We're not talking about reproducibility. There's a lot of things. We're not talking about the quality of the code. We're not talking if the code actually does anything accurately or not, or correctly. So there's a lot of things that we're not talking about here. This really is just FAIR. And for the 4OSS principles, I think have some overlap with FAIR, but they're also looking at a bunch of these other things that we're trying to do, or sorry, that the community overall is trying to do. So I think my answer would be that there's some overlap, but these are actually trying to achieve somewhat different goals as well.
Yes, indeed, they are related, but they are not the same. And we are targeting different aspects.
So I put that question in. Hi, I'm Sarah from Elixir. So yes, I work with Leila and Jen Harrow, and I'm familiar with the 4SS and FAIR principle. But then I'm seeing this almost like a paradox of the prior universe of when we're trying to identify what the Elixir people call the core data resources, and they're looking at elements of FAIR, and they're looking at the element of reproducibility, and they're looking at this everything that was described here. And then I saw some of the comments here saying that why interoperability for the sake of interoperability, or are we trying to define FAIR for software just for the sake of being fair and not really looking into how the application of what we will perform on these FAIR software implies? Am I asking for too much? I'm sorry. By the way, my job description is data interoperability, so I'm here to learn more about the interoperability of the tools.
Dan, you want to say something? Because
I guess I'm not sorry. I'm not completely sure. I think I guess part of the answer to the question, but I don't think this is really the answer to everything that you're asking. So hopefully somebody else can also help. Is that there's lots of different goals that different people have, and here we're really just trying to focus on one, to some extent, narrow set of those goals, even though it's also somewhat broad, with the idea that we can't do everything at once, and we need to break the work to be done into chunks that we can achieve. So I think the things that you're asking are good, but just is a bit larger than what we're trying to address specifically in this group.
So perhaps if I could feedback that we should at least define clearly what we mean by software, because I noticed Moran's comment that service is more than a piece of software, but when some people think about software, they actually think about the software suite that comes in the box, and that's actually a service. So we need to define it clearly what we mean by software and what it sounds like we mean by those codes that are deposited on GitHub, for example. And then we define that we are working on the FAIR scale of things here so that it can be used for further applications, and those are out of scope.
So Moran has a great answer for this coming up.
A great answer for you. Yes, but because we did work about the definition of resource software, which was one part of our subgroups in the first phase of the working group. And we did produce a very nice report on that, which I've put in one of the comments in the notes. And this is all my fault. It's not deposited yet in Zenodo, but it will be very soon. You should see that if you go to the summary report, it's on view only, so you can't do anything bad to it. The answer to your question is that it is very a delicate subject. And the answer that we had in the report is that it is a different thing to different people. It's exactly as you said. And the source code that you put on GitHub and can be archived in Software Heritage, for example, or in Zenodo is something that is not usable at hand. You need to recompile and you need to re-execute to make it usable. But in this source code, you have all the information. And so I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but this is the part I think where it's easier to do FAIR, because you have the source code, you have the information, you can put metadata in the source code, you can put metadata in Zenodo, and you can curate your software in a way that is FAIR. When you go to an executable, the executable is something that only a machine can read, so execute. And if you lose this environment, this piece of software is meaningless, even if you have everything you need in the software itself, but you don't have the environment. You don't know what it can be, what it can do, which is not the same thing with source code, because even if you can't run the source code, you have programmers that know the language and can interpret and see what it can do, even if it's not running and not executed. And so the last part of it is the service. The service is actually the hosted instance on the web, for example. It is something that you can come to and use the tool and then go from there. But if the creator of the service is kind of deleted the service, you will not be able to do anything with that again. So to make it, well, fair in the sense of a fair ecosystem, the service needs much more than just fair to stay, to give you those findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable qualities. So that's why in this report and the work of the subgroup, services is something that we need to consider separately. At least this is what I think. So I see that Leila has her hand raised.
Yes, again, not an answer, but a comment. The difficulty in defining software is kind of similar to the difficulty in data to really distinguish and define data repository versus data registry versus data aggregator versus a data set versus data record versus data collection, because you have different granularities in there and not everybody will understand it in the same way. And you might end up in discussions when two people are talking about exactly the same thing, they are just calling them in a different way. So the discussion that we had in this subgroup in order to define software, one exercise that we did, for instance, was also trying to define what it was not. Because sometimes saying it kind of in the positive is this, it was difficult. So I think, and correct me, Moran, if I'm wrong, we did not really come up with like a definition that, yes, this is the one and this is that will go to the dictionary and this is the official one.
So we did have a definition in the report, and then I copied that into the notes document just below the table. you can find there a distinction between software, research software, and software in research, which is two separate things. While the first one, research software, is the one created during the research process and created for research purpose. And the other one, research software in research, is all the other things that are used, created for usage of research, but are not with this particular hat on. So this is the one that we put in the report. And I hopefully will have a DOI for this report soon enough so you can reference it and cite it. But this is the one that well, it was compromised for this definition. Sorry.
I would also add that the software is fluid. So something can start as a research project and then being research software, but then it can evolve and become a support tool for research. So moving to the other side of the spectrum. So it is fluid, and we saw some examples of that regarding programming languages. They started as a research project, and then they evolved, they gained popularity. And if you ask someone, is this a research software or is it a programming language? Most people will say, yeah, no, definitely just a programming language. But they started with a different hat, let's say.
So I'm trying. Can I refresh the past 5 minutes here, because I understand the hierarchy that Moran just explained, and thank you very much. So are we on the same understanding that when we say FAIR research software here, we just mean FAIR codes, and perhaps no, not FAIR codes, because then you go from codes to executables to the service.
Well, no, not just codes. If you see I will read the research software includes source code files, algorithms, scripts, computational workflows, and executables that were created during the research process or for a research purpose. So it can be executables. For services are not mentioned here, but a service is an executable that just is hosted somewhere. So it's executed continuously
in an
somewhere.
environment, yeah.
Exactly. And for the software components, which is afterwards, that are used for research, but were not created during or with a clear research intent, should be considered software in research and not research software. So this is the distinction we accepted to do, so that when you come to the FAIR principles, and I think we don't discuss it a lot because we had this compromise in the subgroup 3, and then we didn't really go over that. Well, we did go over that with the whole working group, but we need to refresh that time from time again. It will be impossible to do FAIR for everything, because if you don't have control on the software, you can say, oh, I want this piece of software to be FAIR. Oh, well, good luck for you, because you will not be able to do that. But you can control what you do create. And so if it was created, we need to kind of limit it, to scope it. So if it was created in research, this should be FAIR. And this is research software. And the principles which are aspirational principles should be, as I said before, increasingly FAIR. So you cannot do everything at once. You need to see what you can do. And these principles are kind of lightweight. This is also joining Dan's comment from before. They can't address everything to make the software in good software. It doesn't work like that. It's a lightweight principle. I call it for curation quality and not for software quality. So it's really about aspects that are in this FAIR ecosystem to make it a better curated piece of software. Okay, good. I see you.
Thank you, Moran.
You're welcome.
Great. Yeah, I think that this was a great discussion. So I think I hope that that was useful. So thanks, Moran and Leila, for your contribution there. So I think I want to jump to the next question that we have in the document at the moment. What do you need to encourage adoption of the principles in your environment? So that could be in your research group or in your organization, or as part of your PhD thesis, as part of your research. What do you need to encourage the adoption of these principles? Do you need to convince people? Do you need particular resources? I think this is something that it's interesting for us to know what's needed for adoption, and this helps us to set then and think about the next steps of what can we as a working group work towards in terms of maybe guidance or adoption guidelines. So if you already know some obstacles that stop you from adopting these principles, it would be really interesting to hear from you. I'm just keep talking to give people time to think about it a little bit. So please write your name and your answer in the document. And as before, don't feel obliged to answer if you, or to write your name if you don't want to. You can remain anonymous, that's fine. If something comes to your mind and you just want to speak up, that's also, of course, fine. Yeah, so what do you need to encourage adoption? I see a comment: implementation guidelines, principles are not enough. I think this is something that we've noticed from previous interactions with the different groups, that some kind of concrete guidelines of how do I implement these principles in practice, what do they mean for my research. I think that that's something important. In the second part of the session, Leila will cover the work that some of the working groups are doing at the moment. So the FAIR4 Software Working Group has 3 subgroups running at the moment, which are working on identifying adoption guidelines. And so some of the guidelines for adoption are in the process of being developed, I suppose, or adapted. And I think this is something that it's certainly needed by the community as a whole. So I see comment that it's like all other open science endeavors, it's bottom up by teaching the new generation, and top down by providing resources. Yeah, I think I fully agree that I guess that teaching the next generation, I would say it's probably goes in line with the training, providing trainings to not only to future generations, but also to exit to the current generation. Existing researchers might need to have training courses to develop the skills that they need to do the research. So I think that's very much in line with the some of the other efforts in the community, like the software carpentry workshops and things like that. having a software carpentry lesson on how to make your research fair would be fantastic. A checklist of actual steps that one might take for implementation. Yeah, I think that's a little bit in line with the implementation guidelines comment. So I think that's something that definitely it's important for software developers and for researchers in general to have these more concrete guidelines. The services that make it easy automatic for researchers. Yeah, I think that would also be so I guess I wouldn't say necessarily services, because then I might enter in disagreement with Morando on what is a service and how do you define a service. But I guess, yeah, exactly. Tools is probably the word that I would use as well, that making it easier. But yeah, I think making it as easy as possible for researchers and software developers, research software engineers, I think that's a requirement to some extent. So I had one more question in the document. How do you interact with the FAIR principles for research software? So we would really appreciate your feedback on this comment as well, on this question as well. But given the time, I will give the floor to Leila, and maybe we can leave this comment as this question as homework for everybody. If you have a question that you would like to ask there, or a comment that you would like to provide, feel free, but I think it's time that we move on. So Leila, I don't know if you want to take over and start with sharing your screen.
Yes, I will do so now. I just have to find the screen. You should be seeing my screen right now.
Yes.
Okay, let's going to move to the present mode then. Okay, so thank you for the participation in the questions. Hopefully we will have some more minutes for the last question that we have there. In the meanwhile, we will continue with our presentation. So what Carlos presented already was covering mostly the FAIR principles for research software and what we have done in there. Now, right now, November, we are in the month 13th for our group. We are meant to finish by and wrap up by March. So we are working on the adoption guidelines and also examples of adoption, that it is something that people were asking for in the notes. We saw some comments about this in the notes. So we are working right now on that. And we are working on these with subgroups. So I am going to present now the subgroups report, so you know what we are doing regarding adoption guidelines and adoption examples and governance as well. So we have our subgroup 5. In case you wonder why 5 and not 1, we work with subgroups at the very beginning as well, subgroups 1 to 4. So we just continue the numeration. So subgroup 5 is working on adoption guidelines. And what we are doing there is we want to identify existing FAIR research software guidelines and tools. And we are working on a parallel spreadsheet because we want to identify exactly which principle is supported by the existing guidelines, where it is supported, and to see some commonalities and also to identify some gaps in there. We meet once a month in 2 different time zones. So we meet on a Monday and again on a Thursday, different time zones. And we work a lot asynchronous via our collaborative tools, our collaborative spreadsheets and notes. So far, we have collected about 34 resources, and now we are working in the analysis of those resources. So we want to identify the gaps And we want to see exactly what it is covered for those gaps. And that is the work that we are doing right now. We have another subgroup number 6 on adoption support. This is led by Dan and Carlos, and what they are doing there is identifying groups, research groups, people, software projects, organizations, funders, all sort of key stakeholders that are willing to do an early adoption of the FAIR principles for research software. And they are collecting examples on how the principles are being adopted. So right now they are contacting potential adopters and getting responses back. So next they can collect all these responses and they can facilitate the adoption by examples of those that are already doing it. If you are interested in here, just feel free to join. You can find information on how to join the different subgroups. It's fine if you do it at this moment in the collaborative notes, so you can find information in there. Now, the subgroup 7 is about governance. We have discussed a little bit earlier today that we have had different versions already on the FAIR principles. And of course, if you are going to adopt the FAIR principles for research software, you want to know that it is an stable thing, because otherwise it will give you more and more workload that, of course, you want to avoid. So the subgroup governance is working on mechanisms for release onboards. So the idea is that people adopting the FAIR4 research principles know that they are stable, and any release that will happen from now on, they will know what are the rules, what are the phases that new releases should follow in order to keep that stability, so you can feel confident when you are adopting the FAIR4 research software principles. They are working right now in gathering details from the steering committee and mapping out tasks and phases so they can create a document that they can provide to the community, and they aim to finish these at December. In general terms, 3 subgroups aim to finish activities at December, although we know that for early adopters, we might get stories from early adopters beyond December, and that is okay. So don't worry about thinking that, oh, December, no, I don't have time. No, you still have time. So feel free to join our working groups, particularly if you want to become an early adopter. And now we are going to move to some of those early adopter stories. We have some videos, and I really hope the videos will work well. We have 3 early adopters: the Australian Research Data Commons, the Netherlands eScience Center, and the German Aerospace Center. And now let's going to see the videos, starting with ARDC.
My name is Tom Honeyman, and I'm the Software Program Manager at the Australian Research Data Commons. In that program, we have a number of activities working towards recognition of research software as a first-class output of research. The Australian Research Data Commons is part of our federally funded national research infrastructure landscape. Our purpose is to provide Australian researchers with a competitive advantage through data, and our mission is to accelerate research and innovation by driving excellence in the creation, analysis, and retention of high-quality data assets. We have a great many activities spread across our themes of coordination and coherence, data and services, platforms and software, and storage and compute. A cross-cutting theme over the top of all of these areas is FAIR. And to date, our primary focus has been on making data and metadata fair. But we're only too happy to adopt the FAIR4RS principles to help guide how we and our project partners can make research software more fair over time. We'll be doing this across 3 areas. We have policy laying out expectations for making fair the outputs arising from co-investment. So we'll be updating our existing policy on FAIR to reference the FAIR4RS principles when specifically considering research software. Many Australian organisations look to us for assistance when applying the FAIR principles, so we'll be looking to update and create guidance materials and activities to assist with the uptake of the FAIR4RS principles by partner organisations. Finally, although we ourselves are not a major producer of research software, we'll be looking to apply the principles to our own software assets to demonstrate what the impact of adopting the principles can mean.
Good, we can move now.
My name is Tom Honeyman, and I'm the...
We can move now to the next video by the eScience Center in the Netherlands.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rob van Nieuwpoort, and I am the Director of Technology at the Netherlands eScience Center. And as the Director of Technology, I'm responsible for the technology strategy and also for knowledge development and software sustainability. And last but not least, I'm responsible for recruiting of our research software engineers, or RSEs, who are actually our most important asset. Now, the eScience Center is the Dutch National Expertise Center for Research Software. And what we do is we fund collaborative projects together with researchers in all disciplines. And if you think about it, today, research in any discipline is basically impossible without software. And think from climate change to sustainable cities to astrophysical simulations, they all depend on software. And that's where we come in. So we offer our expertise in the form of those research software engineers. And we jointly, together with the researchers, develop this powerful software that helps them with their data management issues, data analysis, designing models, efficient computing, and machine learning. So it's very broad in terms of technology. Now, at the same time, another important activity is that we train researchers in research software development and on how to do that in a sustainable way. So our mission is to make software as broadly reusable as possible, even across discipline boundaries. So we believe in the FAIR4 software principles as a very good starting point for making software reusable in the long term. Now, in our projects, we promote the reuse of software. And in fact, we already use these principles in practice every day. So to support this important cause, the eScience Center intends to adopt the FAIR4 software principles by basically doing three things. The first is that we are using the FAIR4 software principles to support the creation of reusable software as a part of all our projects and all the proposals that we grant as a funding organization. Secondly, we want to contribute by basically training researchers and developing the skills necessary to implement the principles in practice. We do that in terms of a training program, but also by the development of very practical guidelines to help researchers further. So not only the partners that we work with, but also in a broader context, we share these principles. And last but not least, we want to support this community by continuing to promote the principles at the policy level, right? We want to put it on the policy agendas, both at the national and the international level. So we really look forward to the further adoption of these principles. It's an important goal for the eScience Center. So thank you for your attention.
And we have, sorry, I don't look to see really how to change videos. Now we have a third video by the DLR, the German Aerospace Center.
My name is Karina Haupt and I work for the German Aerospace Center, also called DLR, and I'm there the head of the Sustainable Software Engineering Group. DLR focus on a broad range of domains, from aeronautics to space to energy to transportation, digitalization and safety. And in total, we have more than 9,000 employees. For most of these employees, software plays an important role, either in using it or in developing it. And obviously, a focus there is with research software. Since this is not a new development, DLR already started quite some activities in the field of increasing the quality of the software which we develop. So we started, for example, the software engineering initiative of DLR, of which, for example, the development of software engineering guidelines was a big part. And while we already target quite some aspects like sustainability in these guidelines, we don't focus on FAIR software principles. And so we want to change this. So one of the activities we want to include FAIR software principles within DLR is to adapt its guidelines, to extend them so that we cover all the important aspects. Another activity we want to do together with Helmholtz, the Helmholtz Association, where DLR is a part of. And this is to start a research software directory where we make the software from DLR, but also from all of Helmholtz findable. And we already are in the process of doing our first step by showing off like the Lighthouse projects, which are already existing in all the different Helmholtz centers. And yeah, hopefully soon you will have a look and be able to find more and more of our software. Thanks. My name is Karina Haupt and I work for...
Okay, so let me just check quickly the chat in case there are some... No, I think... Okay, I think we don't have questions on the chat. Something that I wanted to say about the early adopters is some of them already are providing some sort of guidelines, and we have seen on some of those that are providing guidelines is that they cover far more than FAIR principles, because we know that in software development, working on good practices is a common element. So some of those good practices will be included in the guidelines that some of these institutes will have. We will focus on the FAIR elements in there, so we can also kind of have a guideline that will work also for other people, particularly for the FAIR principles. And now let's going to move to the last topic that we want to share with you today, and it is the road ahead. Okay, yes, good. So we are working on a roadmap also as part of the activities within the Research Data Alliance, but not fully embedded in the activities of this FAIR4 Software working group. We all know that even with the principles there, the implementation will not be straightforward. And we have observed these already with the FAIR principles for data. Some of the principles might be confusing. You might not know exactly how to tackle one of the principles, or what really you should do in order to fulfill that principle. Some of the principles depend also on community mandates, and you might not even know where to find the right community for you or how a community is defined. So the FAIR4 principles, the principles document is a starting point. The adoption guidelines and adoption stories will complement that, but we also need to think how we will keep walking on this path of FAIR4 principles. And this is what the FAIR4RS roadmap is about. So we want to see and map all of the existing projects that are applying the different elements of FAIR principles. And we want to put them together into a framework so we can provide and we can improve and a strategic alignment. So we stop having kind of silos here and there, and we put them together in a coherent way as well. And we want to identify opportunities for existing FAIR data initiatives so they can be incorporated And we want, of course, keep working on the focus of research software. Michelle Barker from RESA, from the Research Software Alliance, is the person that it is the main person behind this initiative. Some working groups in Research Data Alliance have all been identified as related to this effort. The metrics working group, for instance, the life sciences working groups with Elixir Europe already providing a pilot use case. The FAIR4RS for virtual research environments working group. There is also an interested group. The interested group had the presentation this morning. The working group will have a presentation. It's a new working group. It was just endorsed a couple of weeks ago, and they will also have a session in this plenary, the one session and the repeat, as far as I remember. I know that Sandra was part of the audience, so maybe she can put more information in the chat. I think she had done already so. And there will be another session during this plenary. It will be POF, and it will be a FAIR4RS software skills and training curricula that will be in this plenary as well. So even though we have said that our working group will officially wrap up in March next year, the road ahead, it's still a long one. And some of the members of this working group, Michelle Barker, as I mentioned, have started already working on the FAIR4RS roadmap and how to continue with this effort. So join these different efforts and the sessions if you can. We know that not all the sessions will run in a time zone that will accommodate everybody, but they will be recorded. So you can also see what is going on in there. And I think with this, we are finishing kind of the elements that we wanted to share with you. So it is good. It means that we will still have some time to work on the question that we left pending in there. Here, remember that the link to the slides will be in the collaborative notes, and all the links about how to get involved, how to join the group, how to come to the events, or if you are organizing an event around FAIR4RS software and want support from someone in our group, we are happy to help as well. The steering committee meeting minutes, they are available in GitHub. We have some publications in Zenodo. We have some bibliography collected in Zotero, and we have different community engagement channels that you can see in all the links that we are sharing in these slides, and also you can see some of them in the collaborative notes. We want to thank all of you for participating today, but also all the members for the group and all of those that have been participating in the different activities that we have organized. All the steering committee members, present and past, that have been coordinating a good number of activities, and the Alfred P. Sloat Foundation and Wellcome Trust for their support. So we still have some minutes, 10 minutes, so we can keep working on the document. This question that we have pending, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. The question that we had open on the notes is, how do you interact with the FAIR principles for research software? Maybe some of you are already seeing how to adopt them, and it would be great. It would be great to know if you are doing so. So please feel free to go to the notes. Also, if you want to comment anything about the stories that we share, maybe Dan and Carlos can give you more information about that. I don't expect many people from Australia are with us right now because of the time difference. But feel free also to post questions on the chat.
One more thing that for the document that also if you have any feedback, any thoughts that you would share about the session itself and about what are the takeaway messages for you, we would really appreciate that as well. If you can give us some feedback in the feedback section in the document.
And if you want to add anything live, of course, feel free to open your microphone and share your thoughts. I don't see much activity in the document, and I don't see much activity on the chat or raised hands. So if it is, oh no, wait. Something might appear in the document. At least I can see a cursor right now. No. Sorry if I scared you. But anyway, what I wanted to say is that if we don't have more activities right now, still, as Carlos mentioned, we would really appreciate your feedback on this last question. You can do it right now or you can do it later. Remember that we will have a repeat session. So if you know of anyone that it is interested in this topic but could not join today, we will have another session. And I think we have the information on the notes. I just will double check quickly. So you can share with your friends and tell them, look, if you missed the first session, you still can go to the other one. The other one will be in November 4th. So it will be tomorrow, breakout 6. So
Leila,
it will be.
I
Yes.
have a quick question about the question. The question I see on the document, how do you interact with the FAIR principles for research software? I find it myself difficult to understand what do we mean when we say interact? And maybe this is the reason that we don't see any answers.
Oh, okay.
Would you mind for the next just 2-3 minutes that we have left, kind of explain the homework that we have for the interaction with the principles?
Yes, so what we would want to know here is whether you are already using some of the principles, or even if you didn't have in mind the principles, it happens that you are using some of the elements. For instance, maybe in your group, in your institution, in your network, maybe you are already following the practice of depositing the software in the Software Heritage Foundation or in Zenodo. So that is supporting part of the findability. Maybe you are following the good practice of adding a citation file. I know that there is a discussion that FAIR principles are not about citation and citation is not about FAIR, but there is kind of a blur line, let's say, there is kind of some of relation. So if you are using these sort of elements that are related somehow to the FAIR principles, we would want to know as well. And if you are already adopting them, if you have been following close all the developments of this group and you are already adopting them, but maybe you have not have contact with Dan and Carlos for the subgroup 6, we would also want to know in there. So it's kind of what sort of elements of the FAIR principles are you using right now, or maybe not at all? Do you see it difficult as well? Because we know that FAIR adds more work for, in general terms, it's good to do. It's good to do, but we know that that people might find it difficult. If you have, let's say, kind of a difficult interaction with the FAIR principles, we also want to know about it.
Thanks, Leila, for clarifying. I think that maybe a workshop on this subject about how to really implement the principles would be interesting to have. I don't know what you feel about that, you, Leila, or you, the audience. Would you be interested in this type of workshop?
I would say yes, definitely. We had some discussions. I don't remember if it was in the latest adoption guidelines meeting, but people would like to go one step beyond guidelines and kind of creating tutorials and training materials also. And we saw on the slides on the roadmap that there are some efforts in there as well, because it's difficult for people to really know, okay, I want to make my X object, digital object, software, data, workflows, FAIR. Where do I start? So I would say that it would be great to have a series of workshops in that regard, because with one, we will reach a group. We will have to repeat for different time zones, and we will have to learn from experiences as well on how to improve materials in there. So I'm up for it, totally.
Very ambitious for the series of workshops, but I think you're right. We need to kind of do something that's more hands-on, because until now we have worked on the principles and on a really high level. So something that is more useful for the day-to-day usage of FAIR.
Yeah, this is something that we did with the 4OSS recommendations, for instance. We created some tutorials around it, and we tried to be there as practical as possible, so people could really understand how to implement those 4 recommendations. And I think we need something similar for the FAIR principles as well. So we have 2 more minutes. If anyone wants to share any thought, this is the time.
Yeah, I guess I had these questions this is Chris Erdman. I had these questions about sharing our responses, because I'm actually doing this right now with AGU, and how you would want to receive them, that same interaction question, and I had a sort of I was sending Carlos chats about, like, is this can we share it in a Zenodo community or something like that, so that, it's not like it was with like data management plans all over the place. Where can we find them? So like, it would be great if we had a way to share our responses as well, and it might be helpful for that workshop, for helping inform the workshop. So
feel free to keep adding thoughts to the notes. We will keep them open. The only thing is, please double check that you are in the notes for this breakout session, so we don't go to the other breakout session. But yeah, the document is open. You keep adding your thoughts in there, and it would be great. We would really appreciate this. Thank you very much. And I think, Carlos, I will give you the word now, so you can wrap up the session. It's 30 sharp now, so.
Yeah, so I think the only thing left to say is thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your time, and have a great rest of the day, afternoon, evening, depending on your time zone. So thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.